Ed, for this opening session, we're going to discuss the origins of the poem. And one thing poets are always interested in, especially when you're dealing with a poem that is as unique as this, is where did it come from? How did it get started? What was he thinking about as he started to compose these lines that would reverberate in so many directions down through the ages?
Yeah, it's the great mystery, of course, and we've got a few clues. We do have some manuscripts of passages that eventually will find their way into Song of Myself. We have some early notebooks that we'll talk about that seem to generate Song of Myself. Years ago, I found a manuscript at the Humanities Research Center at the University of Texas in Austin, and it had on the back of it what looked like a passage of Song of Myself. I recognized all the lines, but when I went back to Song of Myself, I saw that the lines were all in different order from where they appeared in this manuscript. This line may have appeared in section 16, this line in section 3, this line in section 42. It was like these lines just had gotten distributed throughout. And yet if you read them in the order he had them, they were cohesive and they formed a pattern. On the other side of this, what I'm taking to be a quite early draft of lines from Song of Myself, is a very strange sheet that he used to take to the printer, to his friend Andrew Rome. And on that sheet, he lays out his ideas for what the poem's going to look like. And one of the most interesting things about that sheet is that while he's trying to figure out the number of words on a page and how many pages that's going to be and how he's going to set it up and what order he's going to put his poems in, he has the poem that's going to become Song of Myself, and in a really fascinating way, he has it broken into 5 sections. Now, critics from the time Whitman published this poem to the present have been struggling with what the structure of the poem is, and we'll talk about structure a little later. But it's interesting to note that in Whitman's mind, he had a kind of 5-part structure. And because we don't have the original manuscript, we can't figure exactly where it broke, but we can figure approximately where it broke because he's giving us the number of pages that are going to be in each of those 5 sections. And it's clearly a long process for Whitman to move from those notebooks where he's taking often prose passages and turning them into lines of poetry to what had to have been hundreds and hundreds of fragments, pieces of paper that had various passages from Song of Myself on them that he was working over and over and over. Song of Myself is one of those poems that as you read it, you have the impression that it's, as Wordsworth talked about it, the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions. It feels so natural. It feels like it hasn't been touched. It just emerged. But as we look at those manuscripts, we see that every word was worked over. Lines were reorganized and reorganized again. He was thinking in terms of sections, and then by the time he published it in 1855, he wanted just one long flow. And then later he would come back and he would say, no, I think I better break this into verses. And so he'd have 390 verses. And then he'd say, no, I need to break this into sections. And so eventually we end up with the 52 sections. And the version we're reading, the final version, the 1881 version, it has 52 sections. And one of the things that we're hoping all of the people taking this course will do is to go on the Whitman archive and to look at Song of Myself in all of the 6 editions, just to see how different the poem looks and how different it feels as the changes are made, as the sectionings are done and undone. Some people prefer the 1855 because it feels so...
One big surge.
One big surge, exactly. And others prefer the final version because it seems to be suggesting some structure. Mm-hmm. One of the things to think about all the way through here is, where does structure enter into Song of Myself? Mm-hmm. Did it enter in at the beginning? Did he have a 5-part structure to begin with that then he erased, basically, for the first version?
And is the structure visual? Is it musical? Is it architectural? It seems to change from edition to edition, doesn't it?
Yep. Thematic, philosophical. I mean, there are so many ways we can approach this poem. And part of the excitement of reading a poem as complex and ever-changing as Song of Myself is to continue to question every approach, every angle that people have had on this poem for 150 years, to try to say, all right, for me, how do I structure it? How do I interact with it? And finally, for me, as a reader, which version of the poem is the best, is the most meaningful?
It's a little bit like Thomas Jefferson excising the passages he wanted from the Bible so that he had his own Bible. You could say that Whitman invites us to create of Song of Myself our own Song of Myself.
Yes, yes. And of course, the Bible is one of the origins. Yeah. As we talked about this past summer when we talked about that origin and others.
So Ed, Song of Myself seems to come out of nowhere. It brings with it a brand new music in American poetry, and readers and writers often think, how did this poem come into being?
Yeah, and that's something that will remain a mystery, I'm sure. When we think of the origins of Song of Myself, I think of the fact that Whitman, born in 1819, really is of the first generation of people who were raised as Americans, as citizens of the United States.
Conscious of that fact.
Conscious of that fact, and born as citizens of the United States. Mm-hmm. I mean, the generations before Whitman were there for the Revolution. Whitman is part of that post-revolution generation. And it's the generation that becomes very concerned about what American literature is going to be. What's going to be distinct, different, exciting about American literature as opposed to British literature. So a literature written in English, and yet one that's beginning already to notice, to celebrate its difference from British English, its growing difference from British English, and a desire on the part of many, many writers in that generation to come up with the epic poem that's going to define American life, American culture, American values. There were lots of attempts at it. Joel Barlow wrote a poem called The Columbiad, and it was an epic poem about the discovery of the New World and the discovery of America. And it begins, I sing the mariner who first unfurled an eastern banner over the western world. All of those epic poems that would begin with the muse singing or with the poet singing, but it would always be of the great themes, the heroic themes. The Aeneid of arms and the man I sing, Paradise Lost of man's first disobedience, sing heavenly muse. Whitman decides to try writing an epic that is an epic of the democratic self. What am I going to sing? not of the legends or the heroes or the founders. I'm going to sing of every founder of America, which is the individual self. I sing myself. I celebrate myself.
It occurs to me that impulse actually has in no way died. We've, for 50, 60 years, had the cry for the great American novel. It seems, some fundamental part of who we are as a people to create in literature what Emerson called that original relationship with the universe.
That's right. And Whitman, interestingly enough, was unsure. You've mentioned the great American novel, and that debate was going on, started very soon after the Civil War. It was part of the healing of the rift between the North and the South, the attempt to find the great American novel that would begin to pull the regions back together again. When Whitman began thinking about what this massive, vast work was going to be that he was going to try to create, this epic of the democratic self, he wasn't sure what form it would take. In his notes, he talks about it maybe being a spiritual novel, or maybe even being a drama. Or for a while he thought maybe the way to really capture the American epic would be to go out on the circuit, the lecture circuit, and give powerful oratory. That maybe in America it was going to have to be the artist, the poet, speaking directly to the people. These are all things that he tries to get into the poem. How can I write a poem that feels as if it's living speech that is delivered directly to the listener?
And we know through the whole gestation period, however many years it may have been, he was taking notes on the way that people talked, on the things that he observed in the street, taking clippings out of different books and magazines that he read. So he's observing, he's absorbing, he's trying to digest. And then there comes a moment where he's able to turn those notes, turn all those notebooks into this line that we recognize as his signature.
Yeah, it's really remarkable to follow that development. He was an inveterate keeper of notebooks. He as a reporter, he had the reporter's notebook, but he carried a little notebook with him everywhere he went, and he was continually writing. He was writing in transit, one of the first writers to really be writing while on the move. He'd be on the omnibuses on Broadway, and you can see in his notebooks the jarring of the tram itself as Whitman is keeping notes and writing what will very often eventually get into Song of Myself. All of those notes, most of them in prose, he was just capturing thoughts, capturing ideas, capturing impressions of what it meant as he looked around him to be part of an emerging democratic ethos, an entirely new way of thinking, an entirely new way of interacting with everyone around him, an urban landscape that in his mind was developing as a kind of non-hierarchical society. And in that one of his very early notebooks, maybe the notebook in which we can most clearly see the emergence of Leaves of Grass, he's writing all kinds of things like he'll write, do not descend among professors and capitalists, he says. And then he'll turn the page and you can see a blank page, and then he turns the page again and there's one magical moment. I've got a copy of it here where he writes, I am the poet of slaves and of the masters of slaves. I am the poet of the body, and I am, and then he stops.
It breaks off.
And then he draws a line through it, cancels it out. And then he starts again. I am the poet of the body, and I am the poet of the soul. I go with the slaves of the earth equally with the masters, and I will stand between the masters and the slaves, entering into both, so that both shall understand me alike. And it's in that notebook entry where he begins to break into what would become his characteristic line, that free-form line. And it's something that just emerges out of the prose, but it seems to have emerged very naturally out of the prose. And he's not even sure, you can tell in those opening lines, whether what he's just written is a poetic line or just some more prose. But he's beginning to take on an eye now that is going to generate an entire poem. And everything great about Whitman, I think, is in those lines. The two lines that get into Song of Myself, I'm the poet of the body and I'm the poet of the soul, but we see it emerging out of a very distinctive issue, slavery, the burning issue of the period in which he wrote these notes in the early 1850s. Fugitive Slave Act is now in operation, and Whitman places himself at the most volatile position in the American culture, between the master and the slave, the ultimate hierarchy, the ultimate irony and contradiction of democracy, that an American democracy was forming with slavery at its heart. This would have to change, and Whitman would now be an eye that would be large enough and vast enough to speak not only for the slaves, but to speak for the masters of the slaves. Could there be an eye large enough to begin to break down that dichotomy?
And you can feel that eureka moment when he wrote, "And I am." Of course he would cancel it because it's such a big moment, such an incredible insight that he has stumbled across. He'd have to start over. But having started over, he now knows how to go back to all the notes he's been taking and will continue to take and figure them in a line that will sing for the ages.
Yes, and once he got that line, once he found that line, that for him would be the organizing unit of all of his poetry from then on. It was a portable
and it moved
line.
quickly too, right? At that point, he started writing much more quickly.
He did start writing much more quickly because he could go back and mine those notebooks. All of that prose in the notebooks he'd been writing for several years, where all of the ideas were there. He was now going back and mining that prose, simply extracting from that prose the ideas and putting them into this portable line, this unit of the line. And then many of his manuscripts literally are cut and pasted. He would take a passage he had written and then he would cut into lines and rearrange the lines. So some of the earliest manuscripts of Song of Myself are passages that never end up existing in the poem itself because they are lines that get into the poem, but lines that might appear in section 1, and then a line that might appear in section 16, and then a line that might appear in section 4, and they have been cut up and repositioned, and he's continually moving those around. Matt Miller, in his wonderful book called Collage of Myself, talks about Whitman as a proto-collagist, sort of the inventor of this idea of continually shifting and moving things around, and his whole life would be moving his poems around.
For years and years, that process never stops till we have the deathbed edition of the poem.
Yep, and right up to the deathbed edition, he's continuing to, at that point, add poems, up until the 1881 edition, moving poems around, taking lines out, retitling, reclustering, just continually moving and moving, cutting and pasting.
Yeah.
The lines were all in different order from where they appeared in this manuscript. This line may have appeared in section 16, this line in section 3, this line in section 42. It was like these lines just had gotten distributed throughout. And yet if you read them in the order he had them, they were cohesive and they formed a pattern. On the other side of this what I'm taking to be a...
Ed, for this opening session, we're going to discuss the origins of the poem. And one thing poets are always interested in, especially when you're dealing with a poem that is as unique as this, is where did it come from? How did it get started? What was he thinking about as he started to compose these lines that would reverberate in so many directions down through the ages?
Yeah, it's quite early draft of lines from Song of Myself. Is a very strange sheet that he used to take to the printer, to his friend Andrew Rome. And on that sheet, he lays out his ideas for what the poem's going to look like. And one of the most interesting, the great mystery, of course. And we've got a few clues. We do have some manuscripts of passages that eventually will find their way into Song of Myself. We have some early notebooks that we'll talk about that seem to generate Song of Myself. Years ago, I found a manuscript at the Humanities Research Center at the University of Texas in Austin, and it had on the back of it what looked like a passage of Song of Myself. I recognized all the lines, but when I went back to Song of Myself, I saw that